She weighed 260 pounds, wore a dead man's debt like a second skin, and hadn't eaten a real meal in 4 days. They called her pathetic. They called her slow. One man in the last town had laughed so hard at the sight of her that he dropped his coffee. But on a cold October morning in 1883, on a forgotten road outside Casper, Wyoming, Martha Whitlock knelt in the dirt beside a withered berry bush and made a silent promise to herself. Nobody will ever have the power to make me beg again. She didn't know yet that a stranger's wagon was about to stop. Welcome, friends. If you love stories about quiet strength, unexpected courage, and the kind of justice that makes your heart pound, you are exactly where you need to be. Stay until the very end. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. The berries were the color of old bruises. Martha Whitlock crouched at the edge of the road, knees aching, fingers numb, breath coming out in short white clouds against the October air, and picked the last 3 shriveled choke cherries from a tangle of dead brush. She turned them over in her palm and stared at them for a long moment, the way a woman stares at something she knows isn't enough, but has to be. She ate them anyway. They tasted like dirt and disappointment, and she swallowed without expression. The Wyoming frontier in 1883 was not a place that rewarded softness. The sky above the Platte River Valley was enormous and indifferent, the kind of blue that offered no warmth and made no promises. The grass along the roadside had already gone yellow and brittle. The aspens had surrendered their last gold leaves 2 weeks ago. Winter was not coming. Winter was already standing at the door, coat on, boots laced, patience worn thin. Martha straightened slowly, pressing one hand against her lower back. She was 26 years old, though the last year had aged her in ways that couldn't be counted in numbers. Her dress was dark wool, patched at both elbows, the hem caked with the pale dust of 3 different towns. Her boots had been resold so many times the cobbler in Rollins had shaken his head and charged her half price out of what she suspected was pity. She carried a single carpetbag, dark blue flowers on a faded burgundy ground, that held everything she owned in the world, which was not much: a spare blouse, a cooking knife with a worn handle, a small tin of salt, a miniature portrait of a man with kind eyes and a terrible head for money wrapped in a handkerchief, and a ledger, small, leather-bound, its pages half filled with careful columns of numbers in her own handwriting. That ledger had once been the household accounts for a small haberdashery in Cheyenne. Now it was just a habit she couldn't break. Martha Whitlock wrote down everything: amounts spent, amounts owed, amounts that would never, under any circumstances, be repaid. Her late husband, Thomas, had been a good man with a generous heart and a catastrophic weakness for business partners who smiled too easily. He'd died of a fever 14 months ago, and the debts had arrived before they'd finished burying him. The creditors had taken the shop, the furniture, the horse, the good china, and the small gold brooch that had been her mother's. They would have taken the ledger too, except that Martha had hidden it inside her corset during the inventory, and she'd held it there, pressed against her ribs, warm and close, all the way out of Cheyenne. Since then, she had moved from town to town, looking for work. The positions she'd been offered in those 14 months could be counted on one hand, and most of them had evaporated the moment the employer got a good look at her. Martha was not small. She had never been small. Even as a girl in Ohio, she'd been the largest child in her class, the one who took up too much space on the school bench, who wore her dresses let out at every seam. Her mother, a practical woman with a sharp tongue she'd only occasionally directed at her daughter, had called her big-boned. The children at school had called her other things. The women in Cheyenne society had smiled at her with their mouths and not their eyes, and offered her second helpings in the particular tone that means we expected you to take them anyway. Thomas had never done any of those things. Thomas had looked at her like she was the most interesting person in every room they'd ever entered together. And then Thomas had died and taken that particular gift with him, and Martha had been left to navigate a world that had very clear opinions about what a heavy woman deserved, and those opinions did not include employment, dignity, or a warm place to sleep. The rejections had come in careful, polished language that all meant the same thing. "We need someone more capable of the physical demands, Mrs. Whitlock. The room above the laundry is quite small. I'm afraid it wouldn't suit. I'm sure you understand." She understood perfectly. She had always understood perfectly. Understanding did not make it easier. It simply made it cleaner, a precise cut rather than a ragged one, which she had long since decided was preferable. She had been moving west because west was the direction she'd been heading when she ran out of money, and stopping seemed worse than continuing. Now she stood at a crossroads 4 miles south of a town called Mercer Flats, a name that did not appear on any map she'd ever seen, with 3 choked cherries in her stomach and no plan beyond keep walking. She picked up her carpet bag, squared her shoulders, and walked. She heard the wagon before she saw it, the creak and rattle of a buckboard, the plodding rhythm of draft horses, the particular sound of iron-rimmed wheels finding every stone in a packed dirt road. Martha stepped to the side without thinking, a habit from months of sharing roads with people who did not slow down for women on foot, and waited for it to pass. It didn't pass. The wagon slowed as it came alongside her, and the horses, 2 big roans, well kept, their winter coats coming in thick, stopped with the patience of animals that had done this sort of thing before. Martha looked up. The man on the box seat was somewhere in his middle 30s, dark-haired, going gray at the temples, with the kind of face that had been weathered by years of sun and wind into something angular and still. He wore a brown canvas coat, a plain hat, and an expression that revealed approximately nothing. His hands on the reins were large and unhurried. He looked at her the way a man looks at a problem he's trying to decide whether to involve himself in. Martha looked back at him the way a woman looks at a man who is about to say something unkind so she can be ready for it. They regarded each other for a moment. "You're picking berries," the man said. It wasn't quite a question. "I was," Martha said. "They're finished now." He glanced at the bare brush along the road. His expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, a calculation of some kind, swift and private. "You heading to Mercer Flats?" "I don't know what's in Mercer Flats," Martha said honestly. "Not much," he said. "Hardware store, a saloon, a post office that closes whenever the postmaster feels like it." He paused. "Where are you coming from?" "Rawlins." His eyebrows moved a fraction of an inch. Rawlins was 23 miles to the south. "On foot?" "My horse had other plans," Martha said, and she said it without self-pity because self-pity was a luxury she had learned to refuse herself. "I traded her for a week's lodging in a ranch house outside of town when the weather turned. It seemed like the practical decision at the time." The man on the wagon box was quiet for a moment. He looked at her carpet bag, then back at her face. He seemed to be thinking carefully about something. "Can you cook?" he said at last. Martha blinked. Of all the questions she had braced herself for, this was not one of them. "I beg your pardon?" "Cook," he repeated with no impatience. "Can you do it? For more than one person?" "Yes," Martha said slowly. "I can cook." "How well?" She considered the question seriously, the way she considered all questions. "Well enough that the people eating don't spend the night regretting it," she said. "Better than that, actually. My biscuits won a ribbon at the Platte County Fair in 1879. My beef stew has been described as, and I'm quoting directly, unreasonably good. And I can make a proper pie crust in under 10 minutes in any weather." The man looked at her for another long moment. "I've got 11 ranch hands," he said, "and a cook who left 3 weeks ago to follow a woman to Denver. Those men are eating cold beans and burned flatbread, and they're starting to make mistakes because of it. Tired men eat bad food. Bad food means tired men. The cycle doesn't end on its own." "No," Martha agreed. "It doesn't. I'll pay $8 a month, room and board." He said it like a statement, not an offer, the kind of number a man arrives at after consideration rather than negotiation. The room is small. The work is not. Martha Whitlock stood in the road with the wind cutting through her patched wool dress and the taste of choke cherries still on her tongue, and she did what she always did when presented with a decision. She thought about it clearly, without sentiment, without panic. The alternatives were continue walking to a town with a post office that operated on the postmaster's mood, with no money, no contacts, and the first serious snow of the season building itself in the clouds to the northwest. $8, she said, and I'll want access to the full pantry inventory on my first day. I need to know what I'm working with. Something happened at the corner of the man's mouth. It wasn't quite a smile. It was the ghost of one, the suggestion that a smile had once lived there and might be persuaded to return. "Silas Mercer," he said, and reached down to take her carpet bag before she could protest. "Martha Whitlock," she said, and climbed up onto the wagon box. He clicked his tongue at the roans. They started forward without ceremony. Neither of them spoke much for the rest of the drive. But the silence was not unfriendly. It was the silence of two people who had each learned, in their own way, not to waste words. The Mercer Ranch sat in a shallow valley between two ridge lines, sheltered from the worst of the north wind by a natural windbreak of ponderosa pines that someone, probably Silas's father, from the size of them, had been wise enough not to cut down. The main house was long and low, built of squared timber, with a wide porch along the front and a stone chimney that needed repointing. The barn was large and sound. The bunkhouse, set 20 yards behind the main house, had a stovepipe but no smoke rising from it at this hour of the afternoon. She noticed things, the way she always noticed things. The porch step that was soft underfoot, rot setting in. The fence post along the garden that leaned at an angle that would not survive a hard winter. The stack of firewood beside the house that looked impressive until you calculated how many weeks it would actually last against a Wyoming January. She noticed these things and said nothing. It was not her place to say anything. Not yet. The kitchen was at the back of the main house, and when Silas pushed open the door and stood aside to let her see it, Martha took one step in and stopped. It was not the worst kitchen she had ever seen, but it was close. The range was a good one, a large iron majestic that would have cost real money, but someone had let grease build up on the top plate until it had carbonized into a layer she could have scraped with a knife. The shelves were disorganized in the particular way that suggested not carelessness, but too many different hands reaching for things without anyone keeping track. Flour in an unlabeled tin next to salt in an identical unlabeled tin next to, she sniffed, what appeared to be baking soda and might possibly be washing powder. The smell of the room was stale bread and old smoke and the particular hopelessness of food that has been cooked without love or attention for a long time. "I'll need a full day before I cook anything," Martha said. "The men eat at 6. Then I'll need to start now." She set her carpet bag on the table, opened it, and took out her cooking knife. She looked at Silas. "Is there a mop?" "A mop," he repeated. "A mop, or a stiff brush and a bucket, whichever you have." He found her a brush and a bucket. He also, after a moment's hesitation, found her an apron, a large canvas one that had belonged to the previous cook, and she put it on over her dress without comment. Then she went to work. She worked for 4 hours without stopping. She sorted every tin, jar, and sack on the shelves, labeling each one with a small piece of cloth and a stub of pencil she found in her bag. She scraped the range top and blacked the iron. She found behind a flour barrel 3 pounds of salt pork that had been there long enough to develop ambitions of its own, and she removed it from the kitchen with the decisive efficiency of a woman removing a problem. Then she took inventory. And what she found, written in neat columns in the back of her ledger, told a story she was not yet ready to tell aloud. The pantry held enough supplies for perhaps 3 weeks of generous feeding, but the quantities were inconsistent in a way that bothered her. 50 pounds of flour, but only 2 pounds of lard, an excess of dried beans and a curious shortage of cornmeal, a full case of canned tomatoes and almost no salt. Someone, Martha thought, studying the numbers, has been taking things. Not much. Not in a way that screamed theft, in a way that whispered it, steady, careful, small enough to dismiss as waste or miscounting. She closed the ledger and put it in the pocket of her apron. Then she built a fire in the range, set a pot of beans to soaking, and started the bread. At 5:30, the ranch hands came in from the pasture. There were 9 of them present that evening. 2 others were apparently on a line ride to the north pasture and wouldn't return until morning. They came through the bunkhouse and across the yard in a loose group, cold and tired, their boots loud on the porch. The first one through the kitchen door was a young man with red hair and a gap between his front teeth, who stopped so abruptly when he smelled the room that the man behind him walked into his back. "Hey, do you smell that?" the red-haired man said. "Move, Decker. No, seriously, do you smell that?" The kitchen smelled like fresh bread, beef broth, rendered onions, and wood smoke from a range that was finally doing what it was built to do. Martha stood at the stove with a long spoon, her sleeves rolled to the elbows, stirring a pot of stew that had been building itself for the past 2 hours out of the salt pork she'd salvaged before consigning the rest, dried onions, the last of the carrots, and a generous hand of herbs from a bundle she'd found hanging, dry and forgotten, near the chimney. She turned to look at the men filling her kitchen doorway. They looked at her. She had been looked at this way before. The swift, involuntary inventory that people performed when they saw her for the first time. The flicker of something crossing their faces. The adjustment. She let them do it. She had learned that fighting the look only made it last longer. "Supper in 30 minutes, she said, in a voice that did not ask for opinions. "Wash your hands first. There's a basin on the porch." Silence. Then the red-haired one, Decker, apparently, said, "Yes, ma'am," and pulled off his hat. The others followed. They ate at the long table in a way that men eat when they've been hungry for a long time and have finally been given something worth eating, with focused, almost reverent attention and very little conversation. The stew disappeared. The bread disappeared. A pan of dried apple compote she'd put together in the last 15 minutes disappeared with slightly embarrassing speed. When the last of them pushed back from the table, a broad-shouldered man with a salt and pepper beard, she would learn his name was Holt and that he was the ranch foreman, cleared his throat. "That was," he said, "considerably better than what we've been eating." "I should hope so," Martha said, collecting plates. "Where'd you come from?" "Rollins, most recently." "Before that?" "Cheyenne." Holt studied her for a moment with the calculating eyes of a man who has spent decades reading people for signs of unreliability. "You planning on staying?" Martha stacked the plates with the efficiency of someone who had done it 10,000 times. "That depends on whether the work is done properly and whether the arrangement proves satisfactory to both parties," she said. "I don't make promises past what I can see clearly." Holt made a sound that might have been approval. He picked up his hat from beside his plate. "We'll see," he said, and walked out. Silas appeared at this kitchen door at 8 o'clock that evening, when the hands had all returned to the bunkhouse and the house was quiet, and he stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands in the posture of a man who is not entirely sure of his welcome. "You can come in," Martha said without looking up. She was at the table with her ledger, working through the inventory numbers again. He came in and sat across from her. He looked at the clean range, the organized shelves, the labeled tins, and the absence of the smell that had presumably haunted the room for weeks. He didn't say anything about any of it. "The men seemed satisfied," he said. "They were hungry," Martha said. "Hungry men are easily satisfied. The harder work is keeping them healthy and consistent over a whole winter." She looked up. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly." Silas Mercer had the kind of face that was difficult to read, but she noticed that his jaw set slightly when she said honestly, as though the word had touched something. "Go ahead," he said. "Your pantry stores are irregular," she said. She turned the ledger and slid it across the table toward him. "Look at this column. Flour, cornmeal, salt. These don't match the quantities they should based on a household of 11 men. Either your previous cook was wasting supplies at a rate that would be remarkable even for a man of spectacular carelessness, or something else is happening." Silas looked at the numbers. He looked at them for a long time. "Or my accounting is wrong," he said, but he said it carefully, without conviction, like a man testing a floorboard. "Your accounting isn't wrong," Martha said. "The numbers are clear. I don't know yet what the explanation is, but I'll want to check them against the supply receipts, if you have them. They're in the desk in the study. May I look at them?" He looked at her steadily. The lamplight between them made the shadows of his face deeper. "You've been here 6 hours," he said. "I have," Martha agreed. "And in those 6 hours I organized your kitchen, fed 11 men, and found something in your inventory that suggests you may have a problem. I'm not trying to overstep. I'm trying to be useful. That is, as I understand it, what you hired me for." Another silence. Then Silas pushed back his chair, stood, and walked to the kitchen door. He stopped there. "The study's the second room on the left," he said. "The receipts are in the top drawer. I keep them bundled by month." He walked out. Martha sat for a moment, looking at the doorway he'd left through. Then she closed her ledger, picked up the lamp, and went to find the receipts. She worked until midnight. When she finally set down her pencil and leaned back in the chair, the lamplight catching the columns of figures spread across the desk, she knew 2 things with certainty. First, someone on this ranch had been quietly siphoning supplies for at least 4 months. Not large amounts, never large enough to be obvious, but consistent and deliberate and, if continued through winter, genuinely damaging. Second, there was something wrong with the cattle numbers, too. a discrepancy between the headcount recorded at the last tally and the supply costs allocated to the herd that suggested either a bookkeeping error or that the herd was smaller than anyone on the ranch officially knew. Martha wrote both findings in her ledger with dates and amounts and careful notations. She wrote the way she had always written, not with alarm, but with the steady hand of a woman who believed that facts, properly recorded, had a way of protecting people who paid attention to them. Then she banked the study fire, carried the lamp back to her room, a small space off the kitchen, bare but clean, and lay down on the narrow bed in her clothes. She thought about the ledger. She thought about the numbers. She thought about 11 ranch hands eating properly for the first time in weeks, and the particular sound of a man saying that was considerably better in a voice that was trying not to sound grateful and failing at it. She thought about Silas Mercer's face when she'd said the word honestly. Outside, the wind had picked up, pushing down from the north, carrying the smell of coming snow. Martha Whitlock closed her eyes. She didn't dream. She hadn't dreamed in 14 months. Instead, she made lists, quiet and methodical, of what needed to be done and in what order and what the probable obstacles were. It was a habit that had served her better than almost anything else she possessed, because lists required action, and action required only herself. The next morning, she was up before 5. She had the range hot, and the coffee made by the time the sky began to lighten, and she was 6 batches into the first biscuit making of her tenure at the Mercer Ranch when she heard the bunkhouse door and the first sounds of the men crossing the yard. Decker, the red-haired one with the gap teeth, was first again. He pushed open the kitchen door, saw the biscuits laid out on the pan, and made a sound like a man who has stepped unexpectedly into good news. "She's still here," he announced back over his shoulder. "Of course I'm still here," Martha said, without turning from the range. "I live here now." Decker came fully into the kitchen and sat on the bench by the wall, wrapping his hands around the tin mug she put in front of him. He was young. She put him at no more than 20, with an open, mobile face that hid nothing and seemed incapable of hiding anything. "Old Joe never had coffee ready before sunup," he said. "Old Joe," Martha said, "is in Denver." "Yeah." Decker sipped his coffee, looked around the kitchen. "You really organized all this yesterday?" "Yes." "In one afternoon?" "In 4 hours approximately, and one evening of bookkeeping." Decker looked at her with an expression that was too young to have learned to disguise itself as anything other than what it was: simple, startled respect. The others came in over the next 10 minutes. They ate with the same focused efficiency as the night before. But this morning there was conversation, carefully impersonal at first, in the way of men who weren't sure what to do with a new presence, about the north pasture fence, about a horse with a sore leg, about the weather. Martha listened to all of it and said nothing. She was learning the room, learning which men talked over others, which ones listened, which ones watched her. There was a lean, quiet man named Garrett who hadn't spoken a word at either meal, who sat at the far end of the table and ate methodically and watched everything with dark, steady eyes. Martha noted him and filed the observation carefully. Holt came in last, poured his own coffee, and leaned against the wall near the stove with the authority of a man who is used to owning a room. "She going to work out, you think?" one of the younger hands said to Holt, in a tone that assumed she couldn't hear. Holt looked at the man, then at Martha, then back. "Son," he said, "that woman had this kitchen cleaner than it's been in 2 years by supper time yesterday, and she made stew out of what I would have called garbage. I'd suggest you keep your opinions to yourself until you have reason to form them." Martha ladled the leftover stew into the pot for lunch and said nothing. But she was paying attention. She was always paying attention. And somewhere in the back of her mind, neat and precise and growing more detailed with every passing hour, the columns in her ledger were already updating themselves, numbers and names and observations clicking into place like the tumblers of a very complicated lock. She didn't know yet what the lock was guarding, but she intended to find out. The snow came on the 3rd day. It arrived without drama. No howling wind, no violent storm, just a quiet, steady falling of white that began before dawn and continued all morning, softening the edges of everything and muffling the sounds of the ranch until the world felt smaller and more enclosed. Martha stood at the kitchen window with her second cup of coffee and watched it settle on the fence posts and the barn roof and the bare branches of the cottonwood at the edge of the yard, and she thought about supply lines, about how many weeks a heavy snow could cut a ranch off from town, and about the discrepancy in the cornmeal that was still bothering her like a stone in a shoe. She had been at the Mercer Ranch for 72 hours. In that time, she had established a kitchen routine that ran like a clock, fed 11 men 3 times a day with food that was hot and sufficient, and in 2 cases already generating unsolicited compliments, organized the pantry to a state of such precise order that she could locate any item in it with her eyes closed, and quietly, methodically, begun the process of understanding everything that was wrong with this place, because something was wrong. She felt it the way she had always felt things, not with alarm or intuition exactly, but with the particular sensitivity of a woman who had spent years watching numbers and knowing that when numbers didn't add up, there was always a reason, and the reason was always human. She refilled her coffee and went back to the supply receipts spread across the kitchen table. Silas had said nothing more about her access to the study. He had appeared at meals with the punctuality of a man who respected schedules and the silence of a man who was still deciding what to make of her. He ate what she put in front of him, said thank you in a way that was brief and genuine rather than performative, and left the kitchen without lingering. He was not unfriendly. He was simply contained, the kind of man who had learned to keep himself behind a certain line and had stopped questioning why. Martha respected that. She was something of the same type herself. What she didn't respect was the number she was looking at now in the October supply receipt, which showed a purchase of 40 pounds of cornmeal from the Mercer Flats hardware store, the same store that, according to the November receipt 3 weeks later, had sold the ranch another 40 pounds of the same. 80 pounds of cornmeal in 6 weeks for 11 men. She wrote the number down. Then she wrote what 80 pounds of cornmeal should have produced, how many batches of cornbread, how many days of feeding, and compared it to what the men had reportedly been eating. Cold beans and burned flatbread, Silas had said, every day for 3 weeks. Burned flatbread was not cornbread, and you did not burn through 80 pounds of cornmeal making flatbread, even bad flatbread, even in 3 weeks. She tapped her pencil against the page and thought about this. She thought about Garrett, the quiet man at the end of the table, the one who watched everything and said nothing. She thought about the way his eyes had moved to the pantry shelves when she'd reorganized them, a quick, involuntary flicker of attention before he'd looked away. She didn't write his name down, not yet. Writing a man's name in connection with a suspicion was a serious thing, and she had learned to be certain before she was serious. But she filed the observation away, careful and precise, in the part of her mind where she kept things that weren't yet ready to be spoken. Outside, the snow continued to fall. The morning passed in the way mornings on a working ranch passed, loud with the sounds of physical labor, smelling of horses and cold air, and the wood smoke from the bunkhouse stove. Martha kept the kitchen range hot and worked steadily through the bread baking and the noon meal preparation and the business of keeping a large, cold house supplied with something warm to eat, and she listened to everything. She had always been a good listener. It was one of the skills that had served her best in life, the ability to be present in a room, apparently occupied with her own work, while absorbing everything that moved through it. People spoke more freely around her than around most, she had noticed. She suspected it was because they had already decided she wasn't worth guarding themselves against. A heavy woman cooking at a stove was not, in most people's estimation, a threat worth calculating. She had long since stopped resenting this. She had started using it. It was Decker who told her the most, though not because he was careless. He was young, and young men talked because silence made them uncomfortable, and he had apparently decided sometime during the first morning that Martha was safe. He talked while he ate, talked while he carried in firewood, talked while he helped her, without being asked, with the heavy lifting she occasionally needed. He had that quality in young men that was either endearing or exhausting, depending on the day, of sharing information without any apparent filtering process. Holt's been running this place for 7 years, Decker told her on the 4th day, carrying a sack of flour from the storage room while she directed. Since before Mrs. Mercer died. He was here before Silas even took over from his father. Is that right? Martha said. Yes, ma'am. There's men in this bunkhouse who'd follow Holt off a cliff, and men who'd follow Silas off a cliff, and they're not always the same men, if you take my meaning. Martha took his meaning precisely. And which camp are you in? Decker considered this with the seriousness of a young man who wanted to give an honest answer. Both, I guess. Silas owns the land and Holt knows it. They work different, though. Silas is... He thinks about things. He'll go quiet for a week and then make some decision that turns out to be right, and nobody saw it coming. Holt's more immediate. He sees what's in front of him and deals with it. And what's in front of him now? Decker set the flour sack down on the table and brushed the dust from his hands. Winter, he said simply. And before winter, the debt payment. Silas borrowed against the ranch 2 years ago to get through a bad cattle season. The note comes due in February. If the fall sales didn't cover it, he stopped, as though suddenly remembering that he was talking to a woman he'd known for 4 days. That's probably not my business to say. You didn't say anything I'll repeat, Martha said. Go on and get the next sack. He went. She stood at the table for a moment, not moving, and added this information to the picture she was building in her mind. A debt payment due in February. A ranch whose books were slightly wrong in ways that were consistent but not dramatic. A former cook who had left 3 weeks ago. An oversupply of certain staples and a deficit of others. She went back to her work, but her mind was somewhere else, moving through numbers, and her expression had taken on the particular stillness that meant she was thinking very hard about something she hadn't yet said aloud. The men noticed the food first. Of course they did. Food was the most immediate and undeniable thing. By the end of the first week, the difference in the ranch hands was visible in the way they carried themselves. Straighter, more alert, moving through the cold with a purposefulness that had apparently been absent for the past month. Holt said nothing about it directly, but she caught him watching his men at work one afternoon from the barn door and nodding to himself, and she understood that the nod was about more than fence posts. Not everyone was grateful. There were 3 men. She had identified them by the end of the week, the way she identified most things, through patient observation, who had a particular quality of watchfulness around her that was different from the watchfulness of curiosity or adjustment. It was the watchfulness of people who were waiting to see whether she would become a problem. The loudest of them was a man named Pruitt, who was built like a barrel and had a laugh that filled a room, and not always in a way that made the room feel comfortable. He was skilled with horses, genuinely skilled, the kind of horsemanship that spoke of years and talent, and Holt valued him for it. But around Martha, he had a habit of making observations in a tone that was just barely inside the boundary of acceptable, positioned so that if challenged, he could retreat to just joking, ma'am. She heard it first from outside the kitchen window on the 6th evening. 2 voices, Pruitt's unmistakable, and another she placed as a man named Wick, small and narrow-eyed, who carried himself with the particular confidence of a person who has always had a bigger friend. Old Silas must be desperate, Pruitt's voice said, low and amused, picking up strays from the roadside. She can cook, though, Wick said, with a grudging quality. Blind hog finds an acorn now and then. A pause. You see the way she moves around that kitchen? Like a... Martha did not hear the rest because she deliberately moved away from the window and turned the page of her ledger with a firm, controlled hand. She had heard variations of this her entire life. She knew exactly what the sentence was going to contain before it finished itself. Had known it so long that the knowledge had stopped being a wound and had become something else. A kind of fuel, cold and smokeless, that burned quietly in the center of her chest and powered the particular quality of focus that kept her working when other people stopped. She wrote 3 numbers in her ledger and underlined them. She was fine. She was also going to be here all winter, and Pruitt was going to eat her cooking every day, and she found that she did not find this troubling in the least. The thing that was actually troubling her was the cattle. Silas had mentioned 11 ranch hands. In the first week, she had counted consistently 9 at meals, with occasional variations as men rotated to line duty. That was normal enough. What was less normal was the conversation she'd had with Decker on the 8th day, when she'd asked him, in a tone of idle curiosity while handing him the breadbasket, how many head they were running this year. Decker had said, about 380, last count, and passed the basket down without thinking. 380. She'd looked at the supply costs allocated to the herd in the October receipts. Feed, salt blocks, veterinary supplies. She'd done the arithmetic, slowly and carefully, twice. The arithmetic was consistent with a herd of closer to 340. 40 missing steers, give or take, could be a bookkeeping error. On a working ranch, cattle moved, died, were sold without perfect record, got separated in bad weather and weren't immediately counted. She knew that. She wasn't a rancher, but she could read a ledger, and she understood that livestock accounting was not like household accounting. But it could also be something else. She mentioned none of this to Silas directly. She wasn't ready yet. She didn't have enough, and she had learned the hard way in Cheyenne that presenting half a case was worse than presenting no case at all, because it gave the other party time to cover their tracks. She simply kept cooking, kept listening, and kept writing things down. It was on the 11th day that the situation with Garrett resolved itself. She had been watching him since the first meal, noting the way his eyes tracked the pantry, the way he was always the last man out of the kitchen after supper, the way he had never once in 11 days offered a word about the food. Not positive, not negative, nothing. Most men, given decent meals after weeks of bad ones, produced at least some variation on this is good. Silence, in Martha's experience, was itself a kind of information. She had also, over 11 days, been conducting a small experiment. She had placed the cornmeal tin in a slightly different position each day. Not enough that anyone would notice consciously, but enough that someone who was used to reaching for it in a specific spot in the dark, or quickly, or without wanting to be seen looking, would have to hesitate. On the 11th evening, she was in the kitchen storage room, a deep pantry off the back of the kitchen, taking stock of the remaining flour, when she heard the kitchen door open with the particular soft carefulness of someone trying not to make noise. She did not move. She heard footsteps cross to the shelves. She heard the small sound of tins being shifted. A pause, longer than it should have been, the pause of someone looking for something in a spot where it wasn't anymore. She came out of the storage room with the lamp. Garrett was standing at the shelves with his hand on the cornmeal tin, which she had placed that morning on the second shelf from the bottom instead of its usual position. He was still dressed in his outdoor coat. He had not come from the bunkhouse. He had come from outside. He looked at her. She looked at him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The lamp cast long shadows up the kitchen walls, and outside the snow had started again, ticking softly against the glass. "It was always on the top shelf," Garrett said. His voice was flat, giving nothing. "I reorganized," Martha said. "I noticed." Another silence. Garrett was not a stupid man. She could see him calculating, behind those dark, steady eyes, the specific nature of his exposure and the specific nature of her knowledge. He was deciding whether to be aggressive or to retreat, and watching him make that decision was like watching a chess player consider a board. "What is it you want to say to me?" he said at last. Martha set the lamp on the table. She pulled out the bench and sat down, and after a moment, because there was nowhere else comfortable to stand, Garrett sat across from her. "I'm not going to accuse you of anything tonight," she said. "I don't have enough yet for accusations, and I'm not in the habit of making them without enough." She folded her hands on the table. "But I want to tell you something, and I want you to hear it carefully." Garrett waited. "Whatever arrangement you have, or had, involving the supplies on this ranch," she said, "it is going to become visible. Not because I'm looking for it specifically, although I am, but because I keep books, and books don't lie, and eventually the numbers will tell a story that is readable by anyone who knows how to read them, including a banker." She paused. "This ranch has a debt payment due in February. If the ranch is short, because of missing supplies or missing cattle or missing anything else, the consequences will not fall on me. They'll fall on Silas Mercer and every man who works for him, including you." Garrett's jaw tightened. "And if I've got nothing to do with missing cattle," he said. "Then you have nothing to worry about," Martha said. "And if you do, then you might want to think carefully about what's worth more to you, whatever you've been taking or the job you'll lose when this comes apart." She stood up, picked up the lamp, and moved toward the storage room. "The cornmeal," she said without turning around, "is on the second shelf, bottom row, left side." She heard Garrett stand. She heard his boots on the floor, slow and deliberate. She heard the kitchen door open and close behind him. She stood in the storage room for a long moment, holding the lamp, listening to the snow outside and the settling of the house around her. Her heart was beating harder than she wanted it to. Not from fear exactly, but from the particular tension of a confrontation conducted carefully, which was the only kind she ever permitted herself. She didn't know if it would work. She didn't know if Garrett was the source of the problem, or only a piece of it, didn't know yet whether he would take what she'd said and make a different calculation. But she knew one thing with certainty. She had been on this ranch for 11 days, and in those 11 days she had fed the men, steadied the kitchen, begun unraveling the bookkeeping, identified the supply discrepancy, and now had opened a door, quietly, without drama, that might lead her to the answer she was looking for. People had spent her entire life telling her she was too slow, too heavy, too ordinary to accomplish anything of consequence. They had said it to her face and behind her back, and in the particular silence of rooms where she walked in and conversation shifted. They had said it in Cheyenne and in Rawlins and on the road between them, and she had carried every single word of it, not to be crushed by them, but because she had found, over the years, that the weight of other people's low expectations was a remarkably efficient fuel. She banked the kitchen fire for the night. She locked the storage room. She took her lamp to her small room off the kitchen and set it on the windowsill, where its reflection doubled itself in the dark glass and the snow fell soft and steady beyond it. She opened her ledger to a fresh page. At the top, in her careful, precise hand, she wrote a single heading, "What I Know." Beneath it, she began to write. The list was already longer than anyone on this ranch would have expected from a woman they'd found picking berries beside a road 11 days ago. It was going to get longer. She would make sure of it. Outside, the Wyoming winter tightened its grip on the valley, and the Mercer Ranch went quiet under its weight of snow. And in the small room off the kitchen, the lamp burned steadily, long after every other light on the property had gone dark. Garrett was gone by morning, not fled. He hadn't taken his saddle or his spare boots, which Martha noted with the careful eye of a woman who understood that what a man leaves behind tells you as much as what he takes. He had simply transferred himself, by some arrangement with Holt that no one explained to Martha and that she did not ask about, to the line camp at the North Pasture, where he would spend the remaining weeks before the debt payment riding fence and staying out of the kitchen. She took this as a partial answer, not a confession, but a retreat. And retreats, in her experience, were their own kind of information. The cornmeal did not disappear again. December arrived and the ranch settled into the particular rhythm of a working property in deep winter. Slower, more deliberate, every task weighted by cold and the necessity of not making mistakes when mistakes were harder to recover from. Martha's kitchen became the center of the ranch's daily life in a way that she suspected it had not been for years, perhaps longer. The men came in from the cold and stood near the range with their hands wrapped around tin mugs, and they talked, first to each other, then gradually, incrementally, to her. She learned a great deal in those weeks. She learned it the way she learned most things, by being present, by being quiet, by asking questions that sounded like small talk and were not. She learned that the Mercer Ranch had once run close to 500 head before the bad season 2 years ago had cut the herd down and driven Silas to the bank. She learned that a neighboring rancher named Aldous Cray had made an offer on the eastern pasture, the richest grazing land on the property, 3 times in the past 2 years, and had been refused 3 times, and had not taken the refusals graciously. She learned that the banker who held the note on the ranch was a man named Fordham Alcott, who operated out of Casper, and who was known, among the ranching families of the region, as a man who called notes early and often, and who had acquired 3 properties in the past 5 years through foreclosures that several people considered premature. She wrote all of it down. The ledger was nearly full now. Both the original pages she'd brought from Cheyenne and an additional section she'd made by folding and stitching together paper from a supply of blank sheets she'd found in the study desk. Silas had seen her working in the kitchen by lamplight more than once and had said nothing, but she noticed that he'd stopped coming to bed, or wherever it was he went in the evenings, without stopping first at the kitchen doorway and looking in, as though confirming she was still there. She pretended not to notice this. She suspected he would stop doing it if he realized she had. The steers were her most pressing occupation during those weeks, and they were also the things she was most careful not to discuss. It had started as arithmetic. The discrepancy in the herd numbers, 40 head, more or less, had led her to a quiet conversation with Decker in which she'd asked, with studied casualness, whether the ranch had any steers that were kept separate from the main herd. Decker had mentioned, without much interest, a small holding pen at the back of the south pasture, where they occasionally put animals that needed specific attention. Injured cattle, animals being fattened for sale, that sort of thing. Martha had asked, equally casually, whether anyone was currently using it. Decker had shrugged. He didn't think so. It was pretty far from the main barn, and the cold made it inconvenient. She had gone to see it herself on a Sunday afternoon, telling no one, wrapping herself in a heavy coat and the wool scarf she'd traded a jar of her apple preserves for from the wife of the Mercer Flats postmaster. and walking the half-mile through frozen pasture to the south holding pen. There were 11 steers in it. They were not, at the time, impressive animals. They were thin-flanked and dull-eyed in the way of cattle that have been given the minimum to survive, and they were alone in a pen that showed evidence of periodic but not frequent attention. The water trough recently filled, the hay rack restocked, but no bedding and no windbreak beyond the pen's south fence. She stood at the fence and looked at them for a long time. Then she went back to the kitchen, and she thought about what she knew, which was 11 steers that did not appear in any current accounting she had seen, in a pen that nobody talked about, on a ranch that was going to need to cover a debt payment in February. She thought about what they could become, with time and attention and the right feeding, which was something she happened to know a great deal about, and she made a decision. She did not tell Silas. Not yet. She needed to know first whether the steers were simply forgotten, an administrative oversight on a ranch that had been understaffed and distracted, or whether they were connected to Garrett's supply arrangement in a way that made their status legally complicated. She needed to understand before she acted, because acting on an incomplete understanding of the situation was a way of making the situation worse. So instead of telling Silas, she began redirecting kitchen scraps. Every ranch kitchen produced waste, vegetable peelings, stale bread, corn husks, the water from cooking beans, the cracked grain from the feed bin that the horses wouldn't touch. In most kitchens, this waste was simply disposed of, or at best, fed to the chickens. Martha began collecting it in a separate bucket and every other day in the early morning, when the ranch was still quiet, carrying it the half-mile to the south pen. She also began augmenting the steers' hay with cracked corn from a portion of the supply she carefully rerouted, documented in her ledger, every ounce of it, because she was not going to take anything without a paper record, and with the kitchen scraps cooked into a warm mash on cold mornings, which the steers discovered immediately and responded to with the single-minded enthusiasm of animals learning they are wanted. She said nothing to anyone. She worked before sunrise and after the evening meal, in the cold, alone, her boots crunching on frozen ground, her breath making clouds around her face in the dark. She did not find it hardship. She had spent her life doing the work that needed doing in the time before anyone else was watching, and she had made a kind of peace with the fact that the work itself was the point, not the witnessing of it. 3 weeks into December, Decker found her. He came around the south fence post at 7 in the morning on a Tuesday, with a look on his face like a man who has found exactly what he expected to find but is still surprised by it, and he stood at the fence and watched her distribute the morning mash and didn't say anything until she had finished. "Holt thinks these steers belong to Cray," he said, "from before Garrett left. That Garrett was running some kind of side arrangement with Cray's foreman." Martha wiped her hands on her work apron and looked at him. "Does Holt know for certain?" "He suspects. He hasn't said anything to Silas because he's not sure, and because—" Decker stopped. His young face was uncomfortable with the weight of divided loyalties. "Because if Silas finds out Cray's been running cattle on Mercer land without paying for it, he's going to do something about it, and Holt thinks now's not the right time, with the debt payment coming." "Decker," Martha said, with a patience that was also a kind of firmness, "these steers are on Mercer land in a Mercer pen, eating Mercer feed. Until someone produces documentation that says otherwise, they belong to this ranch." Decker opened his mouth. "I am not," she continued, suggesting anything improper. "I am stating what is legally true. If Aldous Cray or anyone else wants to make a claim on these animals, they are welcome to present that claim with documentation. If they can't produce documentation, the animals belong to the property they're on." She picked up her bucket. "That is how it works." Decker looked at the steers who had cleaned the mash and were now regarding both humans with the calm, expectant look of animals that have decided the future is probably fine. They were already looking better, filling out in the flanks, coats getting some shine back. "How long have you been coming out here?" he asked. 3 weeks? Every day? Every other. And in 3 more weeks, these animals will be worth significantly more than they were when I found them." She looked at him steadily. "I would appreciate it if you kept this between us for now. I'll tell Silas when I'm ready to tell Silas." Decker looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up the empty mash bucket. "I'll carry that back for you," he said. She let him. She told Silas on the 15th of January. She waited until the evening had gone quiet, until the hands were in the bunkhouse and the house was still, And then she knocked on the study door and stood in the doorway with her ledger and said, "I need to show you something." Silas looked up from the desk where he'd been sitting with his own papers. She could see the bank correspondence in his hand before he set it face down, the careful gesture of a man protecting a worry. He looked at her face, and whatever he saw there made him sit back in his chair and say, "Come in." She sat across from him and opened the ledger to the section she'd prepared. The supply discrepancy, the cattle numbers, the South Penn records, and she walked him through it. She did it methodically, without drama, in the tone of a woman presenting a set of facts and allowing the facts to carry whatever weight they deserved. He was quiet for a long time when she finished. 11 steers, he said. 11, Martha confirmed, currently averaging approximately 900 pounds. In 3 weeks, I estimate they'll be at market weight. And you've been feeding them for 6 weeks. The cost is documented, every pound of it, and I'll reimburse it from my wages if you decide that's appropriate. Silas looked at the ledger. He looked at the careful columns, the dates, the weight she'd estimated by eye and recorded alongside her reasoning. He looked at the list of supply discrepancies, at the footnote about Garrett, at the notation she'd made about Aldous Cray's 3 rejected offers on the eastern pasture. "Martha," he said, and then stopped. It was the first time he had used her first name without the formality of Mrs. Whitlock, and they both noticed it, and neither of them commented on it. "The note on the ranch," he said. "It's due February 12th. The fall cattle sale covered most of it, but there's a shortfall." He said it with the flatness of a man who had been carrying the number alone for a long time. "Alcott, the banker, has already sent a letter suggesting we discuss the terms." "How much is the shortfall?" He told her. She looked at the number she'd written in the margin of the page. Her estimate of what the 11 steers would be worth at current market prices, fully fattened, by early February. The numbers were close. Very close. "They'll need to be in good condition by February 1st, she said, "which means I need to increase the feeding schedule, and I'll need Decker, at minimum, to help me with the morning runs." "Decker already knows, doesn't he?" Silas said. It wasn't quite a question. "He found me 3 weeks ago." Silas was quiet for a moment. "Anyone else?" "Not unless Decker told someone. I don't believe he did." "No," Silas agreed. "He wouldn't." He looked at his hands, spread flat on the desk, and then at her face. "You should have told me sooner." "I know," Martha said. "I needed to be certain first. Of the numbers, of the legal standing, of the condition of the animals. I didn't want to bring you a hope. I wanted to bring you a plan." The silence between them was different from their usual silences, heavier with something that neither of them had language for yet. "All right," Silas said at last. "Show me what you need." The weeks that followed were the hardest. Martha had worked since arriving at the ranch, and she had worked hard since the first morning. She was up before 4, out to the South Penn by first light, back to the kitchen in time for breakfast, then through the full day of cooking and managing and accounting, then back to the South Penn in the late afternoon before dark. Decker came with her on the morning runs, carrying feed and mash with the dedication of a young man who had decided on which side of a thing he was, and she was grateful for him in the wordless way of people who work alongside each other toward a common purpose. The steers responded with an enthusiasm that she found in a private part of herself that she rarely allowed to surface, something close to moving. They knew her by the 3rd week, turned toward the sound of her boots on frozen ground, pressed against the fence with their big, patient faces turned up, breath coming out in white clouds in the cold. She talked to them while she worked, not sentimentally, but practically, narrating the feeding process with the same steady commentary she narrated everything, and they listened with the equanimous attention of animals that have no strong opinions about what is said to them as long as the mash keeps coming. Fordham Alcott arrived on the 4th of February. She heard the wagon in the yard at 10:30 in the morning, and she looked out the kitchen window and saw a man in a dark coat climbing down from a hired buggy. Not a ranch wagon, but the kind of vehicle a professional man hired in town, padded seat and a canopy, the sort of thing that announced itself. He was in his 50s, broad through the shoulders but running to softness, with a full gray mustache and the deliberate movements of a man accustomed to entering rooms and being in charge of them. He was followed by a younger man carrying a leather satchel, and Martha noted the satchel and went back to her bread dough and thought carefully about what she knew and what she was going to do with it. Silas met Alcott in the main room. Martha could hear them through the wall. Not the words, but the register of the voices, the particular music of a conversation that was polite on top and pressured underneath. After 20 minutes, Silas appeared in the kitchen doorway. "He wants to go over the books," he said. His voice was controlled, but she could see the tension in the set of his jaw. "Of course he does," Martha said. She set down the bread dough and wiped her hands. "Silas, have you told him about the South Penn?" A pause. "Not yet." "Good." She untied her apron. "Don't." Silas looked at her. "Let me be in the room," she said. "When you go over the books, let me be in the room." Another pause. Longer this time. The pause of a man weighing something. She met his eyes steadily and waited. And after a moment he nodded, once, with the brevity of a man who has decided to trust something he doesn't entirely understand. Fordham Alcott did not look pleased to see her when Silas brought her into the study and introduced her as his bookkeeper. Alcott's eyes moved over her with the swift, dismissive inventory she had spent her life receiving, and he nodded without warmth and turned back to Silas. "I wasn't aware you'd hired additional staff," he said, in a tone that managed to imply several things at once about the wisdom of that decision. "Mrs. Whitlock keeps the kitchen accounts," Silas said, "and has been assisting with the ranch ledger. I find her useful." Alcott's associate, young, thin, with the slightly harried look of a man who spent his days recording other people's conversations, opened the leather satchel and produced a sheaf of papers. Alcott laid them on the desk with the careful deliberation of a man laying cards. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "I'll come directly to the point. The note on this property comes due February 12th. Based on the fall cattle prices and the sales records your foreman provided in November, there is a shortfall." He named a figure. "Under the terms of the loan agreement, a shortfall of this magnitude allows the bank to move to accelerated collection." "February 12th, Martha said. Alcott looked at her with the patience of a man who has not invited the comment. "That is correct, Mrs. Whitlock, was it?" "February 12th, she repeated, "is the date written in the original loan agreement." She reached into the pocket of her dress. She had started keeping the relevant documents in her dress pocket 3 days ago because she believed in being ready, and laid a folded paper on the desk. "This is a copy of that agreement. The payment date is February 12th. "Correct." Alcott's tone had cooled slightly. "Today is February 4th. She laid a second document beside the first. "This is the letter your office sent to Mr. Mercer in December, suggesting he arrange a meeting at his earliest convenience to discuss, and I'm quoting, the imminent maturity of his loan obligation." "A courtesy notification, dated December 17th, Martha said, "which is 57 days before the actual maturity date." She looked at him with the expression of a woman who is being very precise and intends to continue being precise. "And this, a third document, is a letter your office sent on January 22nd, stating that given the expected shortfall, the bank would need to begin the process of securing the collateral and recommending that Mr. Mercer consider voluntary surrender of the property to avoid the costs of formal proceedings." She set it down alongside the others. "January 22nd is 20 days before the actual due date." The room was very quiet. Alcott's associate had stopped writing. "I mention these dates," Martha said, "because under Wyoming territorial law, a creditor who initiates collection proceedings or pressures voluntary surrender more than 30 days before a note's maturity date, in the absence of a specific default, is operating outside the terms of the standard loan agreement." She folded her hands on the table. "The shortfall Mr. Alcott is referring to is a projected shortfall based on November cattle prices. It is not an actual shortfall because the note is not yet due." Alcott looked at her for a moment that lasted slightly longer than he intended. "You are not an attorney, Mrs. Whitlock," he said. "No," she agreed pleasantly. "I'm a bookkeeper, but the law doesn't require an attorney to read it." She reached into her pocket one final time and produced the document she had prepared with Decker the previous evening by lamplight. A hand-tallied assessment of the 11 steers, with weights, condition notes, and a conservative market valuation based on the current Casper cattle prices she'd asked Silas to obtain by telegraph 2 weeks ago. She put it on the desk in front of Silas and turned it so that Alcott could read it from across the table. "As of this morning," she said, "the Mercer Ranch has 11 head in the south holding pen at an average weight of 940 pounds, in good condition, ready for market. At current prices, their sale value is, and she named the figure written neatly at the bottom of the page in her careful hand. The figure was $14 above the shortfall. Silas looked at the number. Something moved across his face that he controlled quickly, not entirely successfully. Alcott looked at the number for a longer time. "These animals were not in the November inventory," he said. His voice had changed quality. It was still controlled, but something had shifted in it, a slight tightening, the sound of a man recalculating. "They were not in the November inventory," Martha confirmed, "because they were not identified as ranch assets in November. They have since been documented, assessed, and recorded." She paused. "I'd be happy to walk you through the full paper trail if that would be useful." "This property," Alcott said, in a different register now, quieter, more deliberate, the voice of a man who is changing tactics, "is one of the finest grazing operations in the territory. It's my understanding that Mr. Mercer has received offers for the eastern pasture that would more than cover—" "From Aldous Cray," Silas said. It was the first time he'd spoken in several minutes, and his voice was very quiet and very even. "3 times. Mr. Cray is a legitimate business. Mr. Cray," Silas said, "has been running cattle on my south pasture without my knowledge or my permission for at least 4 months. I have documentation of that as well." He looked at Martha. She produced the last document, the supply records that connected the feed discrepancy to the south pen, cross-referenced with the dates of Garrett's presence on the ranch. She laid it on the desk with the others. The study was so quiet that she could hear the wind outside pressing against the windows, and the distant sound of cattle, and the particular ticking silence of a man who has walked into a room expecting to leave with something and is beginning to understand that he will not. Alcott looked at the document spread across the desk. He looked at Silas. He looked at Martha, and in that look was something she recognized. The specific expression of a man who has dismissed a person as inconsequential and is now confronted with the precise cost of that miscalculation. She looked back at him without triumph and without apology. "Mr. Alcott," she said, "the note on this property is due on February 12th. Mr. Mercer will have the full payment, in cash, from the sale of his cattle by February 10th at the latest. If you would like to arrange the formal transfer at that time, I'm certain we can find a convenient hour." She began collecting the documents from the desk, her movements unhurried. "In the meantime, if your office sends any further correspondence suggesting collection proceedings before the maturity date, we will be consulting an attorney about the appropriate response." She stacked the papers neatly. She put them back in her pocket. Then she stood, smoothed her apron. She had put it back on before coming into the room because there was bread that still needed baking, and said, in the tone of a woman whose hospitality is genuine regardless of the company, "Can I bring anyone coffee before you start back to town?" Nobody wanted coffee. Fordham Alcott left 20 minutes later. His associate followed him without making eye contact with anyone. The hired buggy turned in the yard and rolled back toward the road, and Martha watched it go from the kitchen window while she shaped the second loaf of bread and thought about whether to use the last of the rosemary in the dinner stew or save it. Behind her, she heard Silas come into the kitchen. He stood at the door for a moment. She didn't turn around. "You had all of that prepared," he said. Not an accusation, something more like wonder. "I had it prepared for 2 weeks," she said. "I wanted to make sure I had everything before he arrived." Another silence. Then, "The territorial law about early collection proceedings." "I found it in a copy of the Wyoming territorial statutes in your study. 3rd shelf, left side, brown binding." She pressed the dough. It seemed like something worth knowing. She could hear Silas behind her, standing very still in the way of a man who is processing something large. "Martha," he said. She turned around. His face had the look it sometimes got in the evenings when he thought no one was watching. Open in a way, it wasn't when he was managing the ranch and the men and the daily business of being in charge of things. He looked, in that moment, like a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a long time and has just been offered, unexpectedly, a place to set it down. "Thank you," he said. It was 2 words. He meant considerably more than 2 words, and they both understood that, and Martha nodded and turned back to her bread. "Supper's at 6, she said. Tell the men." The steers sold on February 9th. Silas took them to Casper himself, with Decker and 2 of the other hands, and they were gone 3 days. And while they were gone, Martha kept the ranch running with the same quiet efficiency she had maintained since October. Meals on time, fires banked, accounts recorded, nothing neglected. Holt was in charge of the outdoor operation in Silas's absence, and he ran it without interference from her, and she ran the house without interference from him. And the arrangement worked because they were both, at their core, practical people who understood that the work was the point. The men who remained were different from the men she had met in October. She noticed it in small ways, the way they cleared their own plates without being asked, the way they scraped their boots before the kitchen door without the reminder she'd had to issue in the first week, the way they spoke to each other at the table with less of the frayed irritability that hunger and bad food and accumulated exhaustion produces in groups of men living in close quarters through a hard winter. They were not soft. They were ranch hands in Wyoming in February, and softness was not a quality the work selected for, but they were steadier, and steadiness in people was something Martha valued above most other qualities because she understood how expensive it was to maintain. Pruitt was still Pruitt. He had never fully reconciled himself to her presence, and she had long since stopped expecting him to. But even Pruitt, she had noticed, ate everything she put in front of him and had stopped making his observations near the kitchen window where she might hear them. Whether this was respect or simply strategic self-interest, she didn't examine too closely. The result was the same either way. Silas came back on the evening of the 11th, one day before the note was due, with the full payment in bank draft and $14 over, and he walked into the kitchen where Martha was finishing the supper dishes and set the draft on the table beside her with a quietness that was not indifference but its opposite. The quietness of a man who has been moved by something and has not yet found the words. She dried her hands and looked at it. "Tomorrow morning," she said. "Tomorrow morning," he agreed. "Holt's going to ride in with me." "Good." She hung the dish towel on its hook. "I'll have breakfast early. You'll want to be in Casper before noon." She turned back to the sink, and he stood at the table for a moment, and she could feel him behind her the way you feel a change in the air before weather. Not uncomfortable, just present, a weight in the room that meant something she wasn't ready to name. "Alcott is going to be unpleasant about it," Silas said. "Probably," Martha agreed. "Men like Alcott are always unpleasant when a plan fails. It's the only way they know how to respond to being wrong." She began wiping down the counter. "Let him be unpleasant, pay the note, get the receipt, and come home." Another pause. Then Silas said with something in his voice that was not quite humor but had its shape, "You make it sound simple." "Most things are simple," Martha said. "It's the doing of them that's hard." He left. She listened to his footsteps cross the main room, heard the study door close, and went on with the cleaning. She did not sleep well that night, though she would not have said why if asked. She lay in her small room and listened to the wind and thought about numbers. The note, the receipt, the remaining feed costs, the supply budget for the spring. She thought about what it meant that the ranch was, as of tomorrow, free of its debt. She thought about what came after that, and specifically what came after that for her, and she found that the thinking moved in a direction she had been quietly avoiding for several weeks. Her arrangement with Silas had been made in October, on a cold road, for $8 a month and room and board. She had fulfilled it, more than fulfilled it, she thought, without vanity, because vanity about one's own work was a form of imprecision, and she didn't permit herself imprecision. She had fed the men, stabilized the books, identified and ended the supply theft, located and fattened 11 steers that had saved the ranch from foreclosure, and produced enough documented evidence of Fordham Alcott's premature pressure tactics that Alcott would not want to revisit the situation from any legal angle. Her job, in the strictest sense, was finished, and there was nothing in the arrangement yet, the $8, the room, the board, that required her to stay beyond the point at which her usefulness was complete. She had been down this road before, not literally. She had not stood at the edge of a foreclosure and pulled a ranch back from it before. This was a specific situation. But the general shape of it was familiar. The shape of a woman who had done what needed doing and now needed to decide whether to wait to be told she was no longer needed or to leave before that moment arrived, taking her dignity with her. She had learned, in 14 months of widowhood, to prefer leaving to waiting. She fell asleep sometime before 4 and was up by 5, and the breakfast she made that morning was not different from any other breakfast she had made in the past 4 months, except that she made it with a particular attention, the attention of someone who is doing a thing they might not do again. The biscuits were very good. The eggs were cooked exactly as each man preferred them, which she knew by now without asking. The coffee was strong, and the kitchen was warm, and the light coming through the window was the clear, pale light of a Wyoming February morning when the sky has decided, for one day, to be generous. Silas noticed. She wasn't sure how he noticed. His face was as contained as it had always been. But when he came to the table and sat down, he looked at the breakfast and then at her, and his eyes had that quality they sometimes had of seeing more than they should. He said nothing. He ate. He left for Casper with Holt at 7:30, and Martha washed the breakfast dishes and told herself she would decide nothing until he came back. She began packing her carpet bag at 4 in the afternoon. She packed slowly, with the methodical care of someone who has few enough possessions that each one requires individual attention. The spare blouse, the cooking knife, the tin of salt, now nearly empty and needing to be replaced, which she added to her mental list of things she would need to acquire wherever she landed next. The small portrait of Thomas, wrapped in its handkerchief, which she held for a moment and then placed in the bag with the same care she always used. She packed the ledger last. It was full, every page, front and back, including the added section she'd stitched in. 4 months of the Mercer Ranch, in columns and notes and observations, and the particular kind of truth that only numbers could tell. She held it for a long moment, thinking that she should probably make a clean copy of the ranch accounts for whoever would keep them after her, and then thinking that there would be time for that in the morning, and then thinking that she was reasoning herself into staying one more day, and that if she kept doing that, she would stay indefinitely, and she needed to stop. She closed the ledger and put it in the bag. She went to the kitchen and started supper. She was making supper when Silas came back, just before dark, and she heard the horses in the yard and the voices of Silas and Holt, and she thought the higher voice of Decker, who had apparently decided to accompany them, which was not what she'd arranged, but was in keeping with Decker's general approach to decisions. She heard the boots on the porch. She heard the door. Then she heard Decker, before he'd fully entered the kitchen, say, "Oh no," in a voice so transparent in its distress that she almost smiled. He had seen the carpet bag. It was sitting by the kitchen door, closed and buckled, and Decker looked at it the way a young man looks at a thing he doesn't want to be happening, with his hat in his hands and his face open as a window. "Where are you going?" he said. "I haven't decided yet," Martha said with perfect honesty. "Probably wherever the stage goes first." But Decker looked at Silas, who had come in behind him and was standing very still in the kitchen doorway. "She's leaving. She packed her bag." "I can see that," Silas said. His voice was even. The distance between even and other things is sometimes very small. "Tell her she can't," Decker said. "She can do what she likes," Silas said. "She's not a prisoner." "Well, tell her she shouldn't." "Decker," Martha said, not unkindly, "go and wash up for supper." "But go." He went, with the reluctant energy of a young man who has been told to leave a room at precisely the wrong moment and knows it. Holt, who had been in the doorway behind Silas, went with him with the diplomatic instinct of an experienced foreman, and then it was just Martha and Silas in the kitchen, and the supper on the range, and the carpet bag by the door. Silas came in and sat at the table. Not his usual place at the head, but the bench across from the chair she usually occupied when she was working, so that they were at eye level, which she noticed. "The note's paid," he said. "Alcott gave me the receipt without saying a word beyond what was required. Looked like a man who'd swallowed something he'd rather have kept." "Good," Martha said. She stirred the pot. "Martha." "The payment went through without complications." "It did." "Martha." "I'm glad." She tasted the stew and reached for the salt. "I think the spring accounts should be set up differently from how they've been kept. The supply categories are too broad. They don't give you enough precision to catch discrepancies early. I'll write up a suggested system before I go. Whoever keeps the books next can adapt it as they see fit." "I don't want whoever keeps the books next," Silas said. She stopped stirring. The kitchen was very quiet except for the sound of the fire in the range and the wind outside doing what Wyoming wind always did, which was remind you that the land out there was larger than any human concern. "I know what you're doing," Silas said, and his voice was quieter now, the particular quiet of a man saying something he has thought about for a long time and is finally prepared to say out loud. "You're deciding to leave before you're asked to leave, because that's what you've learned to do. You finish the work and you pack the bag and you go, because you've spent so long in rooms where you were tolerated instead of wanted that you've stopped believing there's a difference. Martha turned around. She looked at him across the kitchen. This reserved, angular man who had said more in the last 30 seconds than she had heard from him in 4 months. And she felt something move in her chest that she did not have a precise word for, which was unusual for her, because she had precise words for most things. "That's not," she started. "You've been here since October," Silas said. "You walked into a ranch that was falling apart, and you put it back together, piece by piece, without anyone asking you to do most of it, and without anyone thanking you for any of it. You found the theft and you stopped it. You found the steers and you saved them. You sat across from Fordham Alcott and you took him apart with nothing but paper and arithmetic, and you did it so quietly that I don't think he understood what had happened to him until he was back in his buggy." He stopped. The muscle in his jaw was working. "You did all of that and now you're packing your bag because you think the job's over." "Isn't it?" Martha said. Her voice was steadier than she expected it to be. "No," Silas said, "it's not." He stood up from the bench. He wasn't a man who made large physical gestures. She had noticed this about him from the beginning, the economy of his movements, the way he used space carefully. But he crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and stood close enough that she could see the particular expression on his face that she had categorized months ago as the expression he had when he had decided something. "I'm not asking you to stay as my cook," he said. "The position it's not what I'm offering." Martha looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the wind pushed at the house, and the fire in the range made its small, constant sounds, and somewhere in the bunkhouse she could hear Decker's voice saying something too muffled to make out, which was probably about her. "Silas," she said with great care, "I need you to say clearly what you mean." "I mean, I'd like you to stay," he said, "permanently, as my wife." The words sat between them in the kitchen air. Martha had been proposed to once before, by Thomas, in the parlor of her parents' house in Ohio on a Tuesday afternoon, and Thomas had done it with flowers and prepared remarks and a slightly trembling voice. Silas did it in a ranch kitchen with supper on the range and no flowers and a directness that was entirely consistent with everything she knew about him, and she found that she preferred it. "You don't know me well enough for that," she said. Not a refusal. A statement of the obvious, which she felt obligated to make. "I've watched you work for 4 months," Silas said. "I've watched you handle a thief and a corrupt banker and 11 ranch hands, including Pruitt, which I consider the most challenging part. I know how you think. I know how you treat people. I know what you do when no one's watching, which is the only version of a person that counts for anything." He paused. "I don't need more time to know what I know." Martha looked at the carpet bag by the door. She thought about the road she'd been on in October, the choke cherries, the cold, the 23 miles from Rollins on foot because the horse had been traded for a week's lodging. She thought about the 14 months before that, moving from room to room in houses that were not hers, doing work for people who weighed her value against her appearance and found the arithmetic unsatisfying. She thought about Thomas, who had seen her clearly and loved her specifically, and who had left behind a hole in the shape of a person who looked at her and meant it. She thought about this ranch, which she had walked into as a stranger and had spent 4 months making right, not because anyone required it of her, but because things that were wrong needed to be made right, and she was the person who could see how. She thought about Silas, who had stopped his wagon on a cold October road and asked her one question that had nothing to do with her appearance and everything to do with what she could do. "I need to tell you something," she said. "All right. I have never waited for anyone to tell me I was beautiful," she said. Her voice was calm and precise, the way her voice was when she was stating something she had thought through completely. "I learned very early that it wasn't something I was going to hear reliably, and I made my peace with that and built my life around other things, around what I could do rather than what I looked like doing it." She looked at him steadily. "I'm telling you this because I want you to understand that I am not a woman who needs to be told she's beautiful. That's not what I've been waiting for." "I know," Silas said. "What I've been waiting for," she said, and her voice shifted very slightly, the shift of a woman allowing something out that she has been keeping carefully contained, "is for someone to look at what I can do and take it seriously, not to be surprised by it, not to be grateful for it as though it were a novelty, to simply know that it's there and count on it and build something with it." She stopped. Silas looked at her in the way he occasionally looked at her, without the management he applied to most of his expressions, with the unguarded directness of a man who is not performing anything. "That is exactly what I'm asking," he said. The supper was burning very slightly at the edges of the pot, and Martha reached past him to move it off the heat, and the practical ordinariness of that gesture in the middle of this moment made something loosen in her chest. "I'll think about it tonight," she said. "All right. That means don't say anything more about it until morning." "Understood." She picked up the wooden spoon and began rescuing the stew with the competent efficiency of a woman who has been rescuing things all her life and is not going to stop on account of a conversation. After a moment, Silas went to the door and called in the men for supper, and the kitchen filled with the sounds of boots and voices and cold air and the particular organized chaos of many people coming in from a hard day, and Martha moved through it all with the steady grace of a woman in her element. Decker glanced at the carpet bag, then at her face. He seemed to read something there, because the expression of anxious distress that he'd arrived with shifted into something more hopeful, and he sat down at the table and didn't say anything, which for Decker was a significant exercise of restraint. She served supper, and it was good, and everyone ate it, and the conversation moved around the table with the ease of people who have been living and working together long enough to have stopped performing for each other. Holt talked about the spring cattle plan. Two of the younger hands argued good-naturedly about the best route for the north pasture fence repair. Pruitt said something that made three people laugh, and Martha, from her position at the range, allowed that it was actually funny. After the meal was cleared and the kitchen was quiet, she sat at the table with her ledger and turned to the first blank page she had left. One page saved from the beginning, though she had not known why. She sat for a while without writing anything. Then she wrote, at the top of the page in her careful hand, "What I know." Beneath it, after a long moment, she wrote one line that was not a number, not a supply figure, not an inventory, not an account of any kind she had kept before. She wrote, "He looks at the work. He counts on it. He means it." She closed the ledger. She left the carpet bag by the door. She went to bed, and this time she slept without the lists, without the columns, without the forward-moving inventory of what needed to be done next. She slept the way she had not slept since before Thomas died, fully, without the half-wakefulness of someone who is sleeping in a place that isn't theirs. At 5 in the morning, she got up, dressed, built the kitchen fire, put the coffee on, and began the first batch of biscuits for the day. At 5:30, Silas appeared in the kitchen doorway. He had not yet put his coat on. He looked at her at the range and at the carpet bag, which was still by the door where she had left it. He said nothing. He waited. Martha turned around. "Yes," she said. He nodded once, the same brief, decided nod he used for everything, the nod of a man who doesn't perform his reactions. Then he went to get his coat. Martha turned back to the range. The biscuits were coming along well. The coffee was ready. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten at the edges. The particular cold, clear light of a Wyoming morning in February, when the worst of winter is finally, almost imperceptibly, beginning to release its hold. She was still there. She intended to remain so. They were married on the first Saturday of March in the main room of the ranch house, with Holt standing beside Silas and Decker standing beside Martha, because when she had told him he could stand with her if he liked, he had gone so red in the face with something between pride and emotion that she had looked away to spare him the embarrassment of being witnessed. The justice of the peace came out from Mercer Flats, a thin, serious man named Aldridge, who performed the ceremony with the brisk efficiency of someone who had done it many times and considered it a public service rather than a performance. The ranch hands filled the room to capacity and slightly beyond it, standing along the walls with their hats in their hands and their good shirts on, and Pruitt, of all people, had polished his boots, which Martha noticed and did not comment on. It was not a long ceremony. Neither Martha nor Silas was given to ceremony for its own sake, and the vows they exchanged were the standard ones, said plainly, meant fully. And when it was over, Aldridge shook Silas's hand and nodded to Martha with the expression of a man revising an initial impression, because he had walked in expecting the usual frontier marriage and had instead encountered a woman who looked at the proceedings with the focused calm of someone who has made a considered decision and is prepared to stand behind it indefinitely. Martha had worn her best dress, the dark green wool she had been saving since Cheyenne for an occasion that had seemed, at various points in the past 14 months, like it might never arrive. She had pressed it the night before with a flat iron heated on the range, and she had pinned her hair with 2 ivory pins that had been her mother's, and she had looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand and thought, with the honesty she applied to all assessments, including those of herself, that she looked like what she was, a capable woman of 26 who had survived a great deal and intended to survive a great deal more. She thought that was enough. She found to her quiet surprise that she meant it. Decker cried a little during the ceremony, which he attempted to conceal behind a cough, and did not conceal at all. And afterward he shook Silas's hand with great seriousness, and then turned to Martha and said, "I'm really glad you didn't leave," in a voice so direct and undefended that she put her hand briefly on his arm and said, "So am I," which was the most she was prepared to offer in front of 11 ranch hands, but which she meant entirely. The wedding supper was cooked by Martha herself, because she did not trust anyone else to do it properly, and because cooking was the way she understood celebration, not as an avoidance of the occasion, but as her particular form of marking it. She made roasted beef from a hindquarter Silas had been aging in the cold cellar, root vegetables from the last of the winter stores, 3 kinds of bread, and a dried apple cake with a hard sauce that Holt ate 2 portions of without apparent self-consciousness. It was the best meal the Mercer Ranch had eaten since long before she arrived, and everyone at the table knew it, and the knowing of it sat warm in the room like a second fire. Silas sat at the head of the table and Martha sat to his right, and the men ate and talked with the ease of people who have come through something hard together and are still standing. And outside the March wind moved over the valley with less brutality than it had carried all winter, and the first suggestion, faint and unconvincing but present, of a coming spring was in the quality of the light. That night, after the hands had gone to the bunkhouse, and the house was quiet, and the dishes were done, and the fire banked, Silas came to find her in the kitchen where she was, as usual, reviewing the accounts. He sat down across from her. "You don't have to do that tonight," he said. "I know," Martha said. "I want to." He watched her work for a while in the comfortable silence that had become, over the months, one of the things she valued most about him. His ability to be present without requiring the space to be filled. Then he said, "I want to talk to you about the spring." She set down her pencil. "All right, Alcott isn't done," Silas said. He said it without alarm, as a fact to be reckoned with rather than a disaster to be feared. Men like that don't accept being beaten gracefully. He'll look for another angle. "He will," Martha agreed, "which is why we need to be in a position where there are no angles left available to him." She turned the ledger so he could see the page she'd been working on. Not the accounts, but a plan laid out in her clear columns. The ranch is debt-free as of February 12th. The spring cattle prices, based on the last 3 years of territory reports, should run higher than last fall's. If we increase the herd by 40 head over the summer, which we can do with the proceeds from the spring sale and the remaining reserves, by autumn we'll have a surplus large enough to operate for a full year without credit. Silas looked at the numbers. "That's more conservative than I'd naturally go." "I know. I'm a conservative planner by disposition." She met his eyes. "I'm open to argument." "No," he said after a moment. "No, you're right. Conservative is right for this year." He paused. "What about Cray?" Martha considered Aldous Cray, the neighboring rancher who had made 3 offers on the eastern pasture and had, through his arrangement with Garrett, been quietly running cattle on Mercer land. She had thought about him carefully and at length over the past weeks. "Cray's position is more uncomfortable than he knows," she said. "We have documentation connecting his operation to the cattle in the South Pen and to Garrett's supply arrangement. That documentation doesn't prove criminal activity outright. It could be argued as a misunderstanding between Garrett and Cray's foreman, but it's enough to make any legal action Cray might consider very unattractive." She folded her hands. "I don't intend to threaten him with it. I don't think threats are useful, but I intend to make sure he knows we have it." "How?" "By being visible," Martha said simply. "By running this ranch well enough and openly enough that anyone looking at it can see exactly how it operates and exactly how much we know about its operations. Cray wants angles. Angles require shadows. We're going to make this ranch too well lit for shadows." Silas looked at her for a long moment across the lamplight. "You've been thinking about this for a while," he said. "Since January," she said, "when I first understood the full shape of the situation." He nodded slowly. "All right," he said. We do it your way." She picked up her pencil and went back to the ledger. After a moment, Silas went to bank the main room fire, and the house settled into the quiet of its first night as something different from what it had been before, and Martha wrote her columns and felt, in the steady center of herself, the particular satisfaction of a person who can see the path ahead clearly and trust their own ability to walk it. The spring came in the tentative, provisional way of Wyoming springs, a week of warmth followed by a week of cold, the land making up its mind by degrees, the grass coming up green in the south-facing slopes, while the north sides of the ridges still held their gray winter look. Martha watched the season change from the kitchen window and from the back of a horse, which she had not ridden in over a year and which required some reacquaintance, and from the south pen where the cattle were fattening, and from the desk in the study, which was now also her desk, where she kept the accounts in the new system she had devised and which told the story of the ranch in numbers clear enough that anyone could read them. Decker came to her in April with a question about a neighboring family, the Parkers, who ran a small operation to the east, whose cook had quit, and who were feeding 5 ranch hands on what he called, with diplomatic understatement, insufficient preparations. "Can you talk to Mrs. Parker?" he said. "About the kitchen management? She's willing, but she doesn't know what she's doing, and they're going to lose men if they can't feed them properly." Martha looked at him. "That's not really my business, Decker." "No, but—" He struggled with something. "The Parker boys are good men, and they ride for Silas sometimes during the busy season, and if they can't keep their hands because the food's bad—" "That is actually my business," Martha said, and put down her pen. She spent an afternoon at the Parker Ranch, a smaller, rougher operation than the Mercer, run by a widow named Clara Parker and her 2 adult sons. And she walked through the kitchen with Clara the way she had once walked through her own kitchen in Cheyenne, seeing it as it was rather than as it wanted to be seen. And then she sat at the table and talked with Clara for 2 hours about supply management, about the arithmetic of feeding working men, about which foods gave the most energy per dollar spent, and which were waste dressed up as substance. Clara Parker was a thin, worried woman in her 40s who had the look of someone who had been managing on the edge of her capacity for a long time and knew it. She listened to Martha with the focused attention of a person who is genuinely learning rather than waiting for their turn to speak, and she asked good questions, and by the time Martha left, she had written out a basic supply plan and a weekly menu structure that Clara held in both hands, the way you hold something you're not sure you deserve. "I don't know how to thank you," Clara said at the door. "Run the kitchen well and don't lose your hands," Martha said. "That's thanks enough." She rode home in the late afternoon light thinking about nothing in particular, which was unusual for her, and realized after a while that it wasn't nothing. It was something that felt like contentment, which was different from satisfaction in a way that she was still learning to identify. The trouble with Aldous Cray came in May, as she had expected it to. He arrived at the Mercer Ranch on a Tuesday morning without prior notice, which was itself a kind of statement, the arrival of a man who considers himself important enough not to need appointments, on a good horse and in a new coat, and with the particular bearing of a man who has prepared himself to be either charming or aggressive and is ready to deploy either version depending on what he finds. What he found was Martha in the front yard, inspecting the fence repair that 2 of the hands had finished the day before, with her ledger under her arm and her expression calibrated to neutral. He had not expected her. That was clear from the half-second of adjustment his face made before settling into its prepared expression. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, using her new name with the smoothness of a man establishing that he has done his research. "I was hoping to speak with your husband. Mr. Mercer is in the north pasture until this afternoon," Martha said. "Is there something I can help you with?" Cray looked at her with the assessment of a man deciding how much of his hand to show. He was somewhere in his 60s, broad and silver-haired, with the kind of surface affability that substituted for warmth in men who had spent their lives using charm as a tool rather than expressing it as a quality. "It's a business matter," he said. "Then I'm the right person," Martha said. "I manage the ranch accounts. Please come in." She took him to the study. Not the kitchen, not the main room, but the study with its desk and its shelves and its organized files, the room that said unmistakably that this was a working operation with records. And she sat across from him and opened her ledger to a fresh page and looked at him with the attentive patience of a woman prepared to write down whatever was said. Cray talked for 10 minutes about the eastern pasture. He had a new offer, higher than the previous three, substantially higher, the kind of number designed to feel like generosity. He talked about the benefits of consolidating the grazing land in the valley. He talked about his long relationship with the Mercer family, going back to Silas's father. He talked with the fluency of a man who has rehearsed. Martha listened and wrote nothing. When he finished, she said, "Mr. Cray, I want to ask you a direct question, and I'd like a direct answer." He spread his hands in the gesture of a man who has nothing to hide, which she had observed was most commonly performed by men who had something to hide. "The cattle removed from the Mercer South pasture between August and November of last year," she said. "How many head, and who authorized the arrangement?" The room went very quiet. Cray's affability did not disappear. It was too practiced for that, but it thinned the way ice thins over moving water, the surface intact but the substance changed. "I'm not sure what you're referring to," he said. "I think you are," Martha said pleasantly. "I have supply records, pen records, and a signed statement from the man who managed the arrangement on this property. I'm not presenting them to you as an accusation. I'm mentioning them so that we understand each other clearly." She closed the ledger. "The eastern pasture is not for sale. It was not for sale when you asked the first time, or the second, or the third. It is not for sale now, and the Mercer Ranch is not in any sense in a position that makes it vulnerable to the kind of approach you've been taking." She met his eyes. "I think you came here today to find out whether that was true. Now you know." Cray looked at her for a long moment. He looked at her the way Alcott had looked at her in February, with the specific expression of a man who has made a calculation about a woman and is confronting the cost of having made it incorrectly. It was an expression she was becoming familiar with, and she found that it bothered her less each time she saw it. "You're a formidable woman, Mrs. Mercer," he said, and in his voice were approximately equal parts of something that might have been respect and something that was definitely resentment. "I'm a practical one," Martha said. "The difference is important." He left without the eastern pasture and without the affability he'd arrived with, and Martha watched his horse carry him back down the valley road, and then went to the kitchen and started lunch, because it was 11:30 and the men would be in from the pasture at noon, and they would be hungry. She told Silas that evening, giving him the account with the same precision she gave all accounts, and he listened with his elbows on the desk and his hands folded and his eyes on her face, and when she finished he said, "I should have been there." "You were in the north pasture," Martha said, "where you needed to be. This was something I could handle." "I know you could handle it," he said. "That's not—" He stopped, tried again. "I don't want you to always have to handle things alone." Martha looked at him. The lamplight was soft in the study, and outside the May evening was warm enough for the first time to leave the window open a crack, and the smell of the grass came in on the air, green and clean and full of the seasons returning. "I'm not alone," she said. It was a simple statement of fact, the most precise kind, and she meant it completely. Silas nodded. They went to bed with the window open and the spring night air in the room, and the sounds of the ranch settling around them, and Martha lay in the dark and thought about the road in October, and the choke cherries and the cold and the carpet bag, and she thought about how the distance between that morning and this one was not large in months, but was very large in the kind of measurement that actually counted. And she felt the distance not as loss, but as territory crossed. Ground she had moved across under her own power, by her own choices, without waiting for anyone's permission. She slept. 5 years passed the way years pass on a working ranch. Not slowly, not quickly, but with the density of time that is fully used. Each season brought its specific demands, and Martha met them with the same organized attention she brought to everything, and the ranch met her back with the particular faithfulness of a place that is being cared for properly. The herd grew. Not recklessly. Martha's conservatism held, and Silas had come to trust it, as he trusted the weather charts and the grass reports, and the other forms of careful observation that protected the operation from the enthusiasm that had undone so many frontier ranches. They added 40 head in the first year, 30 in the second, and by the 5th year the Mercer herd was one of the strongest in the territory, their beef known for its quality by buyers in Casper and as far east as Cheyenne. The accounts were impeccable. This was known because Martha had made them available, not in a boastful way, but in the transparent way of a person who understands that visibility is protection, that a well-run operation has nothing to fear from being seen clearly. The territory's agricultural assessor had visited twice in 5 years and left both times with the look of a man who has found things in better order than he expected. Cray made no further approaches to the eastern pasture. He had reorganized his own operation after what was quietly referred to in the region as his arrangement with Garrett became known among the ranching families. Not from anything Martha or Silas had said directly, but in the way that truth moves in small communities, gradually and then all at once, until the knowing of it is simply part of the landscape. His foreman had been dismissed. The 3 offers on the eastern pasture remained, in the documented memory of the valley, as a kind of illustration of the kind of man he was. Alcott had retired from the bank in 1885, replaced by a younger man named Stroud, who operated with the straightforward competence of someone who had learned from watching his predecessor's failures what not to do. Stroud had called on the Mercer Ranch twice, both times in connection with ordinary business, and had each time made a point of complimenting the account keeping, which Martha received with a nod and did not otherwise remark on. Decker had stayed. He was 25 now, broader in the shoulders and less given to talking than he had been at 20, though not less warm. He had simply grown into himself, as young men do when they are in good surroundings long enough. He had become Holt's acknowledged successor in training, if not yet in title, and Holt, who was past 60 and had begun to let go of certain things by increments, seemed comfortable with this. Holt himself had changed in a way Martha had watched with quiet attention over 5 years. In the first months, he had been professionally respectful and personally cautious, the posture of an experienced man who is waiting to see whether a new element in a system he knows well will prove sound. By the end of the first year, he had moved past caution into something that she recognized, from long observation of the type, as the guarded respect of a man who doesn't offer it easily. By the 3rd year, he had begun doing something that she suspected he was not entirely aware of, coming to her first, before going to Silas, with operational questions that were within his own authority to decide but on which he wanted a second opinion. She always gave it directly and without ceremony, and he always left with the expression of a man who has gotten what he needed. She had never discussed this with Silas. It was not the kind of thing that needed discussing. Their son was born in the spring of 1886, a large, loud, healthy boy named James Thomas Mercer, the Thomas for reasons that Silas understood and respected without requiring explanation. He came into the world with the emphatic physical presence of someone who intends to occupy space thoroughly, and Martha held him in the lamplight of the room that had once been just hers, and looked at his face and felt something that was beyond her system of columns and records, something she didn't try to quantify, because some things were not made better by quantification. Silas sat on the edge of the bed and looked at both of them with the unguarded expression that only she ever saw, the one he kept behind the contained, angular face he showed the ranch and the world, and she thought that this was the expression she had been working toward without knowing it. Not the saved ranch, not the paid note, not the defeated banker. This room, this man, this child who was already, in his first hours, looking around with the bright, focused attention of someone taking inventory. "He's going to be trouble," Silas said. "Yes," Martha agreed, "he is." She was not wrong. By the summer of 1888, the 5th year, the one Decker marked by pointing out that Martha had been on the Mercer Ranch longer than any hand currently in the bunkhouse, except Holt himself, the ranch had become something it had not been before. Not larger, necessarily, or not only larger, but different in quality. The quality of a place that knows what it is and runs accordingly, with systems and habits that held regardless of the season or the difficulty of the year. Women came from neighboring ranches to talk to Martha about kitchen management, about supply accounting, about feeding large numbers of working people efficiently and well. She received them in the kitchen, which was her element, and she talked to them plainly and practically and gave them written plans they could take home and adapt. And she did not charge for any of it because the women who needed it most were the women who could least afford to pay, and this was simply arithmetic. Clara Parker's ranch had stabilized within a year of Martha's afternoon visit. Clara had sent a jar of her best preserved plums the following Christmas, with a note that said, "Only thank you," in the handwriting of a woman who doesn't write often, but means what she writes when she does. Martha had put the plums in the pantry and the note in her ledger, pressed flat between 2 pages, and that was all she did about it. The evening of the anniversary came in early September, cool and clear, the light going gold over the ridgelines in the way of late summer evenings when the day has been long and everything is finally, briefly, still. Martha stood on the porch with James on her hip. He was 2.5 and had opinions about being carried that he expressed with considerable force, but he had been fed and bathed and was in the cooperative phase of the evening. And she looked at the valley spread below the house, the cattle in the near pasture, the barn with its sound roof, the bunkhouse with smoke beginning to rise from its chimney as Decker or someone started the evening fire. Silas came to stand beside her. He had been in the north pasture all day, and he smelled of horses and grass, and the particular outdoor smell of a man who has spent a long day doing physical work. And he stood close enough that their shoulders touched, and James, who regarded his father with the specific adoration of a small child for a large and reliable presence, reached out one imperious hand and grabbed Silas's coat. "Hard day?" Martha said. "Long," Silas said. "Good." He looked at the pasture. Henderson came by. She knew Henderson, a rancher from the north of the valley, a straightforward man with a large operation and a tendency to speak directly. "About?" "He wants to buy 20 head in the spring. Says he's heard our cattle are the strongest in the territory." Silas paused. "He also asked if you'd be willing to come and talk to his wife about the account system. He said, specifically, that his books were a mess and that he'd heard yours were the best kept in the county." Martha looked out at the valley. The light was deepening, turning the grass from gold to copper, and somewhere in the pasture a calf called for its mother with the particular urgency of a creature that has momentarily lost track of the most important thing in its world. "The county," she said. That's what he said. She was quiet for a moment. She thought about the road in October 1883 and the choke cherries and the worn carpet bag with its dark blue flowers on burgundy ground, which was still in the house, in the back of the wardrobe in their room, because she had never gotten around to replacing it, and had perhaps, in some part of herself, not wanted to. She thought about the kitchen she had walked into on her first day, with its carbonized range and its unlabeled tins and its smell of hopelessness. She thought about Fordham Alcott's face when the numbers had refused to behave the way he'd expected them to. She thought about what it meant to be known for something, not for appearance, not for the fact of her size or the lack of it, not for the way she occupied space in a world that had very specific ideas about how much space she was entitled to, but for the thing she could actually do and had done and would continue to do with the same steady, undecorated competence that she had applied to every day of the past 5 years. The best-kept books in the county. She allowed herself privately to be satisfied by this. It was the specific variety of satisfaction that comes from a thing being recognized not as a surprise, not as remarkable for someone like her, but simply as what it was. Good work, recognized as good work. Nothing more complicated than that, and nothing less. "Tell him yes," she said. "Tuesday afternoons work for me." Silas made a sound beside her that she had learned over 5 years to recognize as his version of a smile when he wasn't making his face do it. James reached up and took a fistful of Martha's hair with the proprietary confidence of a child who considers his mother's person to be a reasonable extension of his own territory. And Martha detached his hand with practiced patience and shifted him on her hip and looked at the valley one more time. 5 years ago, she had stood on a road 23 miles from here with 3 withered chokecherries in her stomach and no plan beyond keep walking, and a stranger had asked her a single question that had nothing to do with what she looked like and everything to do with what she could do. The ranch spread below her in the evening light. The cattle, the fences, the barn, the bunkhouse with its fire. And it was not, she thought, what she had built. She had not built it alone, had not built it from nothing, had not done any of the 10,000 things it represented by herself. She knew better than to claim that kind of credit, because false accounting was still false even when it was flattering. But she had kept it. She had found it tipping, and she had steadied it, with her hands and her mind and her ledger and the particular quality of attention she brought to everything. The attention of a woman who had been told all her life that she did not deserve good things and had decided quietly and without drama to prove that wrong by the accumulation of evidence. The evidence was here, in the accounts, in the cattle, in the hands who stayed year after year, and the neighbors who came to ask her counsel, and the boy on her hip who was going to be, she was reasonably certain, a great deal of trouble and a great deal of joy. In the man beside her who had stopped a wagon on a cold road because he needed someone who could cook, and had found, instead, something he had not known to look for, and had been wise enough to keep it. The sun touched the ridgeline and the valley went briefly, perfectly golden, and James made a sound of contentment that was also a sound of imminent sleep, and Martha shifted him against her shoulder and felt his weight settle into her the way weight settles when it belongs there. She did not say anything. There was nothing that needed saying. She stood in the evening light on the porch of her home, and she was still. She had always known who she was. It had only taken the world a little time to catch up.